Chapter 23 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Chapter 23 of Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Recognition. Saturday came. Torn, ragged clouds were driven across the sky. It was not a becoming day for the scenery, and the little girls regretted it much. First they hoped for a change at 12 o'clock, and then at the afternoon tide turning, but at neither time did the sun show his face. "Papa will never buy this dear place," said Elizabeth sadly, as she watched the weather. "The sun is everything to it. The sea looks quite leaden to-day, and there's no sparkle on it. And the sands, that were so yellow and sun-sparkled on Thursday, are all one dull brown now." "Never mind, to-morrow may be better," said Ruth cheerily. "I wonder what time they will come at?" inquired Mary. "Your papa said they would be at the station at 5 o'clock. And the landlady at the Swan said it would take them half an hour to get here." "And are they to dine at 6?" asked Elizabeth. "Yes," answered Ruth. "And I think, if we had our tea half an hour earlier, at 4:30, and then went out for a walk, we should be nicely out of the way just during the bustle of the arrival and dinner, and we could be in the drawing-room ready against your papa came in after dinner." "Oh, that would be nice," said they, and tea was ordered accordingly. The south-westerly wind had dropped, and the clouds were stationary, when they went out on the sands. They dug little holes near the incoming tide, and made canals to them from the water, and blew the light sea foam against each other, and then stole on tiptoe near to the groups of grey and white seagulls, which despised their caution, flying softly and slowly away to a little distance as soon as they drew near. And in all this Ruth was as great a child as any. Only she longed for Leonard with a mother's longing, as indeed she did every day, and all hours of the day. By and by the clouds thickened yet more, and 1 or 2 drops of rain were felt. It was very little, but Ruth feared a shower for her delicate Elizabeth, and besides, the September evening was fast closing in the dark and sunless day. As they turned homewards in the rapidly increasing dusk, they saw 3 figures on the sand near the rocks, coming in their direction. "Papa and Mr Donne!" exclaimed Mary. "Now we shall see him." "Which do you make out is him?" asked Elizabeth. "Oh, the tall one, to be sure. Don't you see how papa always turns to him, as if he were speaking to him, and not to the other?" "Who is the other?" asked Elizabeth. "Mr Bradshaw said that Mr Farquhar and Mr Hickson would come with him. But that is not Mr Farquhar, I am sure," said Ruth. The girls looked at each other, as they always did, when Ruth mentioned Mr Farquhar's name, but she was perfectly unconscious both of the look and of the conjectures which gave rise to it. As soon as the 2 parties drew near, Mr Bradshaw called out in his strong voice: "Well, my dears, we found there was an hour before dinner, so we came down upon the sands, and here you are." The tone of his voice assured them that he was in a bland and indulgent mood, and the 2 little girls ran towards him. He kissed them, and shook hands with Ruth, told his companions that these were the little girls who were tempting him to this extravagance of purchasing Eagle's Crag, and then, rather doubtfully, and because he saw that Mr Donne expected it, he introduced "my daughter's governess, Mrs Denbigh." It was growing darker every moment, and it was time they should hasten back to the rocks, which were even now indistinct in the grey haze. Mr Bradshaw held a hand of each of his daughters, and Ruth walked alongside, the 2 strange gentlemen being on the outskirts of the party. Mr Bradshaw began to give his little girls some home news. He told them that Mr Farquhar was ill, and could not accompany them, but Jemima and their mamma were quite well. The gentleman nearest to Ruth spoke to her. "Are you fond of the sea?" asked he. There was no answer, so he repeated his question in a different form. "Do you enjoy staying by the seaside, I should rather ask?" The reply was yes, rather breathed out in a deep inspiration than spoken in a sound. The sands heaved and trembled beneath Ruth. The figures near her vanished into strange nothingness. The sounds of their voices were as distant sounds in a dream, while the echo of one voice thrilled through and through. She could have caught at his arm for support, in the awful dizziness which wrapped her up body and soul. That voice, no, if name and face and figure were all changed, that voice was the same which had touched her girlish heart, which had spoken most tender words of love, which had won and wrecked her, and which she had last heard in the low mutterings of fever. She dared not look round to see the figure of him who spoke, dark as it was. She knew he was there. She heard him speak in the manner in which he used to address strangers years ago. Perhaps she answered him, perhaps she did not, God knew. It seemed as if weights were tied to her feet, as if the steadfast rocks receded, as if time stood still. It was so long, so terrible, that path across the reeling sand. At the foot of the rocks they separated. Mr Bradshaw, afraid lest dinner should cool, preferred the shorter way for himself and his friends. On Elizabeth's account, the girls were to take the longer and easier path, which wound upwards through a rocky field where larks' nests abounded, and where wild thyme and heather were now throwing out their sweets to the soft night air. The little girls spoke in eager discussion of the strangers. They appealed to Ruth, but Ruth did not answer, and they were too impatient to convince each other to repeat the question. The first little ascent from the sands to the fields surmounted, Ruth sat down suddenly and covered her face with her hands. This was so unusual. Their wishes, their good, was so invariably the rule of motion or of rest in their walks, that the girls, suddenly checked, stood silent and affrighted in surprise. They were still more startled when Ruth wailed aloud some inarticulate words. "Are you not well, dear Mrs Denbigh?" asked Elizabeth gently, kneeling down on the grass by Ruth. She sat facing the west. The low, watery twilight was on her face as she took her hands away. So pale, so haggard, so wild and wandering a look the girls had never seen on human countenance before. "Well, what are you doing here with me? You should not be with me," said she, shaking her head slowly. They looked at each other. "You are sadly tired," said Elizabeth soothingly. "Come home and let me help you to bed. I will tell papa you are ill, and ask him to send for a doctor." Ruth looked at her as if she did not understand the meaning of her words. No more she did at first. But by and by the dulled brain began to think most vividly and rapidly, and she spoke in a sharp way which deceived the girls into a belief that nothing had been the matter. "Yes, I was tired. I am tired. Those sands oh, those sands! Those weary, dreadful sands! But that is all over now. Only my heart aches still. Feel how it flutters and beats," said she, taking Elizabeth's hand, and holding it to her side. "I am quite well, though," she continued, reading pity in the child's looks, as if she felt the trembling, quivering beat. "We will go straight into the dressing room and read a chapter that will still my heart, and then I'll go to bed, and Mr Bradshaw will excuse me, I know, this one night. I only ask for one night. Put on your right frocks, dears, and